Welcome to the Sustainable Travel Podcast. I'm Emma, your host from That Travel, and today we'll be talking with Susanna Shankar, a sustainable tourism expert with a master's in biodiversity, whose aim has been to bridge the gap between environmental and tourism research to inspire positive impact of travel. So, hi Susanna, how are you?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me back on your podcast. I always really enjoy our chats.
Yeah, me too. And obviously today, as you know, but the audience doesn't know yet, we're going to be talking about animal cafes, which I feel is this hotly debated topic at the moment in the world of travel. And you've been posting about it really nicely. So I'm very excited to get into this topic. And everybody who listens to the podcast knows that I love anything animal related. So when
Yeah.
it's one of these episodes, I'm always very like, I can't wait to get into it. So cool. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about you for everybody who didn't listen in on the last episode that you kind of came onto. Yeah, and what it is that you do.
Yeah, I think you gave me a very good brief introduction. But I've been in the travel and tourism industry for about 15 years in different roles. Everything ranging from a local tour guide to travel writing, content creation, and more recently, kind of an academic lens. So you mentioned that I do have a master's in biodiversity, and my research particularly focused on integrating nature-based solutions into tourism management to address some of the more adverse impacts that we see from tourism. And I think in particular relation to animal cafes, this was actually one of the more surprising connections that I found between tourism and biodiversity. Um, I grew up really thinking of cat cafes or just cat cafes. That's really all I thought there was. And it was kind of this more ethical model of a cat cafe that was working directly with shelters to give cats a little bit more visibility through like a viable adoption process. But over the years, I started to see like some trends on social media, the ones that make like I stopped scrolling and I'm like, why is there a capybara sitting next to a person in Japan? They're not native to Asia, those kinds of things. But I didn't realize how big or widespread this issue was until I went to Japan. And I remember I was kind of turning this like corner into like from a quiet street into this main area of a town or like a neighborhood called Harajuku. And my jaw just dropped with like everything that I saw. I mean, there was otter cafes, pig cafes, there was like a 5-story mall-like structure with different types of small animal cafe like experiences, owl cafe, Shiba Inu cafe. And I was like, wow, like I had no idea there were so many types and it was such a big commercialized industry. And I think another thing that surprised me was the lines of people going to see, like waiting to go see them. And I was like, these are giving me all sorts of red flags. Why isn't it the same for everyone else? But I've learned that there's a cultural difference at play. And these cafes are so good at ethics washing and marketing tactics. And they really do play on people's emotions that most of us that love animals are sometimes the ones that are unintentionally causing them harm. So I kind of made it my mission to hopefully, rather than shame people, like educate them so they can build a little bit better critical thinking skills and make more informed choices when it comes to these cafes. So
Yeah,
hopefully we'll continue that here today. Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, I think like already so many good points, but it's just one of those things where we do have to be really careful walking the line between sort of saying this is a problem and shaming people. Whenever it
Yeah.
comes to anything to do with animals, wildlife, like there is a huge shame culture. And I think not only from the industry as a whole, but we put that on ourselves when we realize, I've done something that's potentially harmful, or I've
Yeah.
even just I've taken part in something harmful. It's not a nice feeling. It's so horrible. It makes you kind of think, am I a bad person? Like I've done
Yeah.
bad.
I've had that feeling before. I mean, I've done things in my past, right? You wrote that article for me about koala cuddling.
Yeah.
I am very guilty of doing that. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize. And it made me feel bad, but that's not ever the feeling that I want to pass on to anyone. So hopefully just education is like a building block, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, I think it's really important to say like we don't know until we know.
Yeah.
This is something that it raised red flags for you, but you have a whole master's in this topic and looking
Yep.
at why
Yeah.
these wild animals shouldn't be in places where they are not adapted to the environment, where they're not conditioned. And we're going to get into all that. But if
Yeah.
it took you this long to see it, then maybe people shouldn't be feeling bad and just taking the information as it comes.
Absolutely not. And I think one of the things I learned was to, reading through all of the reviews of these places and, Reddit comments, it was to build a little bit more empathy for, people that do go to these places and kind of have the feeling that maybe something's not right, and also to just really look at the marketing tactics of these places, and they are very, very convincing. So yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of the time, I think they don't even think of it as necessarily this unethical thing. They just think,
Uh-huh.
well, I like my animals that I keep as a tourist attraction, and I'm going to
Yeah.
treat them kindly, but it's
Yeah.
not necessarily it's not necessarily right for them. So, like you said, this did start with cat cafes. I was looking this up, and apparently the original one was in Taiwan, in Taipei, and it used to be called Cat Flower Garden. It was actually 1998, which was a lot earlier than I expected. Um, but
Yeah.
I always thought of it as cat cafes too. And when I heard of them, I kind of assumed, well, yeah, like the cats will be in there to get rehomed. But it's not necessarily always the case. And now it's even expanded, like you said, to wildlife. What do you think tourists need to know before visiting these kind of cafes, if they're going to visit them?
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so I think from this original cafe, which I think was really to provide a space for people in small apartments that couldn't have cats. So I think even the original model, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't really even to adopt. It was more for people who couldn't have pets at home to come and kind of socialize around animals. And I think it kind of took like a split or a fork. And on one path, we see, particularly in areas with stricter animal welfare guidelines, the more kind of like charitable vetted adoption cafes that are a bit more regulated and work with shelters directly. And then on the other path, I think a lot of people maybe capitalized on the profitability of these businesses. And I think at some point, people realize that you can make a lot more money with exotic and wild animals. So a general person is willing to pay a little bit more money to maybe interact with an Asian small clawed otter or raccoon or something that they see in the wild, and they want to know, like, how does it feel? What is it like? Just kind of this like urge to be around animals that they may not otherwise. So it became a very profitable and lucrative business. And it upholds the whole kind of like wildlife trade, breeding mills. So there's a lot of people now involved in this business. So it is kind of a huge economic thing that's really upheld on like animal trading. But when it comes to what tourists or travelers, I think, should know, the first is really anytime you see an exotic or a wild animal in a cafe, these animals should not be enclosed spaces with humans ever, especially like the general public. So that's just the first thing I think. The second thing, right, we talked a little bit about their ethics washing. These um, exotic and wild animal cafes are very good at ethics washing, which is they're presenting themselves as more ethical than they really are. So they'll say things like, "Well, we limit the amount of time that the animals interact with you," which is kind of typically a good thing that you want to see. You want to see that there's these animals aren't around people all day. But then they will do things like limit food and water from the animals. So they're very oftentimes malnourished and they're more excited and eager to be around people. So an animal that is underfed, they're going to be more excited to be around somebody that is feeding them. So even if they say we don't force interactions, they encourage them in different ways that you don't necessarily see as like a paying customer. And they'll even say things like we rescue them, but maybe they're rescuing them from like a pet store where they are part of a breeding mill. So they're very good with these marketing tactics. So don't always take them at face value. Look for transparency and really in-depth information. The second thing I think is trust your gut, but remember, most of us are not wild animal experts. Even some people specialize in certain animals, and that doesn't even make them an expert on all animals. So trust your gut. If you do go into one and you get a bad feeling, it is okay to leave. It's okay to like listen to that little gut feeling. It's almost always right when it comes to animal experiences. But then also, if you're there and things look fine on the surface, remember that just because you perceive an animal as appearing to be happy or satisfied, you're not an expert in that animal's behavior. And a lot of animals, especially like capybaras, may have silent stress indicators. And I always say that unless you're testing that animal's poop for cortisol, you're probably not really aware of how stressed it is, right?
Yeah.
The third thing is there's a big risk of zoonotic disease transmission. So there's a risk of Salmonella, E. coli, roundworms that can be fatal to humans. And some cafes even house primates, which are part of the disease control, infectious disease control law due to high risk of transmission. So health and hygiene is a big issue. Um, and finally, just stop and think, where are these animals coming from? And I think that is such a key question to ask yourself. If you just stop before you go in and you look at what kind of animals they are and think, where do I think these animals come from and how did they get there? If there's a bunch of Asian small clawed otters that are native to India, you might not know that, but like if there's a bunch of otters in downtown Tokyo, just stop and think, why is that? And if you can't really logically answer that for yourself, that's probably a problem. So they're either coming from breeding rings. So there's now like otter and owl breeding mills. They're either taken from the wild or they're trafficked and part of this like animal trade industry. So I think those are some kind of things maybe to help you just think critically before you go in. And
Yeah.
if you have, yeah,
I, well, one thing I always find is really helpful when we're talking about these kind of experiences is just to make a very split distinction between wild and domesticated, which shocked me that it's not
Mhm.
a lot of people know. And it's, I guess, quite hard to differentiate. Like, if I were asked before I did reading into this, what is the difference between domesticated and wild?
Mm.
I think
Yeah,
I'd kind of say, well, dogs, like I wouldn't know. So just
yeah,
kind of set that out a bit, like a domesticated animal is one which has adapted for years and years, like usually centuries, to live alongside humans. So it's become part of their DNA that they're more comfortable with humans. Usually their characteristics have changed. And a wild animal is simply anything else. So you can
yeah,
have a tame wild animal, it's still part of their instincts to be wild, and they'll still be kind of uncomfortable around humans. And that's why we say these animals shouldn't be in these cafes at all, because there's
yeah.
no real way to make it ethical if the animal is wild.
Yeah, and I think this also comes into, you're not necessarily, we're not wild animal experts. And so there are some animals that are wild that have been raised alongside humans and will appear friendly around humans, but that doesn't make them necessarily domesticated or appropriate to be around humans. Yeah. So,
Exactly. Like
yeah.
that. Sorry, I have a dog in the frame for anybody watching.
Hi.
Exactly. Like just because they have been bred or raised alongside humans, it doesn't mean that they've been done so for
Yes. Yeah.
years and DNA has changed. So I think that's really important to differentiate. Also, a lot of the other things that you said, they do really come down, like you mentioned, just to that gut feeling of thinking, am I comfortable? And if I'm not comfortable, even if you don't know why, it's
Yeah.
usually right. Like that
That's
voice.
why I say your gut feeling is almost always right in those situations. And it's okay to leave. If you walked in and paid and you're like, wow, this was a mistake and I don't feel comfortable here, it's totally okay to leave. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and like you said as well, we can't know their different behaviors, we can't know that kind of thing. And there's almost never an ethical way to do this with wildlife in cafes. So I just think avoid them.
Yeah.
Then we've got sort of the other hand of domesticated animals, like this one. Uh,
Hi.
so like this would be animals that have kind of been adapted to live alongside humans. So cats, dogs, sheep, farmyard animals, they're not inherently frightened of necessarily like living alongside human beings, and they're not
Yeah.
necessarily of us feeding them, or they're not going to react wildly. But there's still some things that we need to know there, and I think a lot of people think that all cafes like that are fine. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit there on what people can look out for?
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked to quite a few people that genuinely had no idea that there was really anything other than cat cafes. And we've seen a rise in things like pig cafes, which pigs are a domestic animal, but they probably shouldn't be in a clinical cafe setting in like urban environments. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there with like just because cats, dogs, or farm animals have been domesticated really to live alongside humans doesn't necessarily make them always okay in kind of enclosed spaces or kind of like forced interactions with humans. So I think with domestic animal cafes, I think depending entirely on how they're managed and run, they can be some of the more ethical ones or some of the most problematic ones. And I always like to first look at differentiating kind of between their like business model and their motives of how they're operating. So, if you ask yourself, like, is this a for-profit business that really puts making money possibly over animal welfare? So, for-profit animal cafes do exist, and they treat animals more like a commercial commodity, and they rely on kind of cute or young animals to bring in and make money. And some cafes will put making money kind of as their highest priority. They'll really go through any number of lengths to make that happen. So the example I gave of like these pig cafes, there is almost, it's like a chain that you see across some parts of Asia. It's called like Me Pig Cafe. And it's micro pigs, which is not actually a breed of pig. They're pigs that have been stunted with growth. So they're actually like restricted food in order to stunt their growth. But they're basically piglets, and at some point they actually do grow bigger. But this cafe really operates on kind of having like piglets come in, and they've kind of popped up everywhere. And they really just treat these pigs almost like inventory or living inventory. I read a couple of reviews where someone asked cafe staff where they got their pigs, and they're like, "Oh, we just call up our breeder and say we want a certain color pig, and we get that." So they're just like inventory, just like you might order 12 boxes of holiday cups for your like coffee shop. They're kind of just like this inventory. And if they get too old or if they get sick, there's not veterinary care available for them, or the company may not want to spend money on that. Sometimes they're returned to high kill rate shelters, or they oftentimes experience premature death because the living conditions and welfare conditions are so poor for them that they die of natural causes, but quite young. And on the flip side of that, you have, I know it's really heartbreaking. Yeah, there's also like Shiba Inu cafes, which are like breed specific domestic animal cafes. And those are really just upholding breeding mill industry as well, because they're only looking for one type of breed. But with domestic animals, I think on the other side of that, you have the like nonprofit kind of charitable one that I think a lot of us are a little, maybe a bit more familiar with. They're not automatically good by default just because they're running a nonprofit or a charity. But they're a better starting point. And I think the primary goal here isn't necessarily to make money off the animal, it's to make money to reinvest into the animal's welfare, whether it's spaying and neutering them, or covering adoption fees, or providing vetted adoptions. And they still need regulations in terms of like customer interactions, the number of people that are in the cafe, how they're interacting with these animals. What happens if an animal isn't adopted? Do they give it a life, like a full-time home? So there's still a lot of things that need to go into nonprofit domestic animal cafes that make them a bit better than others.
Yeah, I think the domesticated animal cafes are where it gets very nuanced, and it's like
Mhm.
not a black and white conversation anymore. We can't necessarily say that you can't keep these animals indoors because this
Yeah,
obviously works. You have things like cafe dogs and cafe cats that live very happy lives and are perfectly fine, but
yeah,
like you said, maybe they shouldn't be in there long term. Maybe they should have limited interactions. Always, I think, a safe space where they can get away
yeah,
to if they need to. What you said about the pigs is obviously very heartbreaking, but there's another layer of that that kind of is the breeding industry of animals, where I think we need to sort of look at these kind of places. And this doesn't just go for cafes, it obviously goes for breed standards and the way that we breed kind of dogs and cats for um, aesthetics.
yeah,
This is a bit of a problem. Like that model sounded problematic because it is to
yeah.
kind of treat animals like these commodities and say, right, well, when I need more, I'm just going to call up and get more. And yet here we sit in this kind of overpopulation rescue crisis. It's probably not the best idea to be breeding domestic animals on demand for cafes and that kind of thing.
Absolutely not. But right, those cafes are operating, like Shiba Inus are a very popular brand, and people want to see them because they're cute. And so they'll just, that's like the only breed they have. They purchase them from a breeder. Um, and they're primarily kept as young dogs, but they're stressed. They're not raised alongside a human companion that is caring for them full time.
Mm.
I don't know what happens in the back of house at some of these places, but like with these more commercialized ones, like the Meat Pig or the Shiba Inu cafes that are very like for profit driven. I don't know what happens in the back of house, but I really assume that these animals are probably just put in cages at night and kept in the facility, right? Because it's not like they're going home with a person every night. So yeah, just kind of thinking. I always describe this situation as like an iceberg, and what you're seeing is just this very surface level thing, and underneath there's breeding mills, animal trafficking, all this dark stuff that can potentially be under there. But then also there's the potential for getting cats out of shelters, getting dogs out of shelters, and giving them into vetted, loving homes, right? So can be a really good thing or a really dark thing. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we both probably have kind of opinions on breeding anyway. Like I know we've
Yeah.
both kind of been in the rescue business with
Yeah.
cats and dogs and that kind of thing, which is maybe a whole different podcast. But
Yeah.
all this to say, like, it can be problematic in domesticated animals, but then the flip side is if you've got wild animals, and you mentioned this already before, I don't really know where people think those animals come from apart from the illegal wildlife trade.
I don't think people stop and ask themselves that until later. And I think right. I think having walked by a lot of these businesses, I think their marketing is really just like, oh my gosh, puppies, oh my gosh, pigs. And you almost have this like dopamine spike that just sort of like carries you through. And I read a lot of blogs of people that I really value who went to some of these cafes and wrote very reflective, blog articles on why they would never visit or why they got a bad feeling. And it is sort of, they were on this like high coming in. And then once they got in, they started to ask themselves these questions. Wait, why is there like a fennec fox, which is supposed to be in the desert, sleeping in a corner on the floor?
Mm.
And you kind of like, I just encourage you to ask yourself those questions. Try to ask yourself those questions beforehand. Why are there a bunch of pigs in the middle of a city? Why are there a bunch of otters in, just think about that. And even if you don't fully understand the wildlife trade, because it's a very big, complex, unfortunately, industry. And if you, I mean, like, I think that it even requires a lot of just kind of like research and kind of education to make yourself more familiar with that. So even if you don't understand that, just if you can't answer your question of like why there are a bunch of otters or capybaras in this cafe, it's probably not a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my wishes for any wildlife experience or any animal experience in general is just for people to kind of sit and ask themselves the questions beforehand because I think that's where we fall down a lot is we just, and it's lovely in a way, right? People are very naive and they kind of go into this thinking, and then myself included, I'm also very naive, but we go into this thinking, how lovely, I get to see an owl or a capybara is basically just a big guinea pig. And it's like, it's
Yeah.
actually not. It's a wild animal that isn't suited to this environment. And yeah, we just need to be a lot more careful. But when we're talking about the illegal pet trade, that is sort of like you said, this enormous global industry that maybe it's going on in the background, maybe you didn't know. But then there's also the question of like what's going to happen to the animals after they're done in the cafes, which is equally like scary for the life.
Yeah. Yeah, I read, I mean, there's several cases where they'll return them to high kill rate shelters. And I'd have to pull up the exact statistic, but I read a number on the percentage of kill rates in some of these, in particular in Japan, because I did a lot of research on Japan. The percentage of animals that are killed in shelters is astronomically high. So sometimes they'll return otters to the pet store that they bought them from, but these pet stores have such a high kill rate. And it's not like they're adopting those otters out to like the regular person. So they call them pet stores, but really it's not a pet store, right? It's like the equivalent of saying like, telling a kid that your dog went off to the farm to live a happy life. That's not the case. And I read one kind of like expose from an owl cafe worker that said their owls would get sick. The owner didn't want to pay for veterinary care. They would die. They would order more. And it was just this circular system. And owls would die after like, 6 months because they would get sick. And yeah,
Yeah, and like this is also why I feel like it's very important to have this distinction between domesticated and wild because in a similar vein to you, like I made a post a while ago saying, and it had like a few things, and then in amongst it kind of said like animal cafes, and I had people saying agree with you for wild animals, but I went to one for hedgehogs. And I'm like, oh, a hedgehog's wild. I think it can get really complex when you then consider like people genuinely think that they're going to basically a pet store or a petting zoo, and they don't
yeah.
quite understand that no, like owls aren't for petting. They're not pets, they're wild animals. Hedgehogs aren't for petting. And I don't really know how we spread that information accurately.
Yeah, it's tough, right? And I think even African pygmy hedgehog is a probably a whole conversation. Yeah, hedgehogs should not be pets. I 100% agree
Yeah.
with that. Like hedgehogs are not suitable for pets. They have highly specialized needs. So I think even no matter how they've been bred, I don't think they're suitable pets for the normal person or anyone really. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, and even the small animals that people think are fine. So these cafes, like a lot of them will have hedgehogs, guinea pigs, ferrets, and those are also not suited for these cafes. And there really are just like glorified pet stores again, where people are kind of like sitting around hanging out with them. And what makes things even more difficult is I saw cafes with mixed animals. So you would see the poster, and there would be a hedgehog, a guinea pig, a hamster, and then one random otter. So you can look at this as, is this a domestic animal cafe? Is it a wild animal cafe? They're very rarely sometimes they're like almost like a menagerie of different animals, and those are also not okay, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that comes back to the whole I want to be surrounded by all the animals of the forest, Snow White moment, which is again
Yeah.
like such a lovely fantasy, but unfortunately not good for the animals in the same way that it might be enjoyable for you. It's definitely a complicated issue all around. I think it's not as straightforward as like just head to a cafe and assume they'll be doing the right thing. We can't do that in any capacity with any animal experience at the moment. But
Yeah.
I know I was reading your blog and I know that you've visited a couple of cafes which you've had like mixed feelings about, like some good, some bad. Um, do you want to share a bit about like any that you've either enjoyed or not enjoyed and like what the reasoning was?
So I actually haven't really visited that many cafes. I mean, honestly, the last like true animal cafe that I visited was in my hometown like 15, 20 years ago. And this was very much like that. Like I was on my way to donate some food and pet supplies, and it was operating within a shelter to kind of like provide this like more engaged space where people could offer vetted adoption. I have encountered a lot of animal cafes on my travels, and I think this is more me seeing them and doing a lot of research on them. Would I visit one in the future? I would say I'm open to it, but I don't see myself visiting one. And I'll tell you why. But I want to start by saying that this is just very much my personal like individual situation, but it doesn't make it like the right approach, right? So this is just what I would like, what my thought process is, and probably why I wouldn't visit one. I think in my version of an ideal cat cafe, they're operating within their community to provide a service, which is to offer vetted adoptions to the public, and they have like a close relationship maybe with their local shelter or an organization that is trapping cats out of the wild and spaying and neutering them and rehoming them. And for me, as someone who has a cat, who has companionship with a cat, I'm not currently looking to adopt. So I don't really see myself needing to go into a cafe that, in my ideal situation, is providing adoption services, right? Or like working to adopt cats. So I think, especially a lot of these places, they should be regulating the number of people that are in them. And I don't really want to be a body taking up space in a facility that I think maybe ideally someone else who's looking for adoption could come in and find the right cat for them or dog. And I think when it comes to like the tourism element of like traveling to visit these cafes, I sort of take the same approach. Like, I'm not going to really, I know some people that do like adopt pets when they travel or dogs or cats off the street. And I think that's wonderful. But in a cafe setting, again, as a traveler, I'm not really looking to adopt. I have my cat at home that I get to come home and cuddle. So I'm not really looking for the service I think that they're providing. What I typically do is I would rather donate to an organization or even a cat cafe that I think is doing good work. And I like for myself donations for a few reasons. I think no matter what, as soon as you're creating a transaction, which most of these cat cafes or domestic animal cafes do have like a cover charge to get in. So you'll pay like an entrance fee and then there's opportunity to buy food or beverage. But there is a cost to get in typically. As soon as there's a transaction involved, no matter the intention, I think, of the cafe or the person, I think human nature has somewhat of an expectation to get something back.
Mm.
And if you read through a lot of the reviews on cat cafes here in Vancouver, where I currently live, a lot of the one-star reviews are like, not worth the price, too expensive to get in. I didn't get to hang out with that many cats. There wasn't a lot of interaction. And so I like donating because I feel like for me, there's just like no expectation to really feel like I'm getting anything back. And so I'd rather donate to someone that I think is doing good work. And the second reason is that I think allows them to continue servicing the community, offering the service that they're providing. And one of the things I did when I was in Japan, I was on Okinawa hiking, and I came across like a group of kittens like on the side of the hiking trail that were alive. I assume their mother was out hunting. And as both a cat, an animal lover, and a biodiversity person, this breaks my heart for two reasons: that I feel for the cats that are out there in the wild in this harsh environment. And I also feel for the native biodiversity on this island, Pacific Island. It is, I mean, feral cats are notorious to be one of the most devastating predators in where they're introduced in feral. And Okinawa in particular has like three endangered endemic species that are very much threatened by feral cat population.
Mm.
So what I did is I found a local NGO working on the island. I contacted them, geotagged the location of the cats, and they're a group that goes out and traps cats in the wild and will spay and neuter them and work to rehome them with someone. So, and then I made a donation to them to kind of allow providing them that service. So for me, I'd rather almost have that kind of donation experience as I travel rather than going to cafes. But that's just my personal approach because, like I said, I have a cat. I'm not looking to adopt at the moment. So that's just my personal kind of the way that I look at that. Yeah.
It's so hard because I think we all, not we all, but like a lot of people who travel have like they're compassionate people. They want to
Uh-huh.
do good in the world. And a lot of us really love cats and dogs. But like you said, cats are devastating. Like they're responsible for the extinction of like over 50 species worldwide, which is crazy.
The statistics are staggering. It's very
Yeah.
upsetting. Yeah,
And I believe they're the number one killer of birds in the world as
they
well.
are in almost every continent. Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah.
yes, we all love cats, but we have to be realistic about the fact that we have bred them to overpopulation. We've introduced them in a lot of places, and it's very problematic. And then, we're talking about these cafes that ultimately should be a solution and often are not really being used as a solution. They're actually being used as the opposite because they're causing these breeding rings. We think we're making it better, and we're just not, again. Um, so it is complex. I do feel for
Yeah.
people. I feel for cats. I feel for dogs, any animals in these kind of facilities. It's hard.
Yeah. And right, I think yeah, my ideal cafe is actually working with a local NGO to get cats out of these environments where they are killing birds and, native wildlife, and they're spaying and they're neutering them and ideally rehoming them if. So that is kind of my ideal flow and model of something that's happening. It is so rare, I think, unfortunately, and those kind of experience, those models are, I think, few and far between, but they can be really valuable and they can be really important. But which is kind of why if I do find that example, I would probably be more willing to donate. In the situation in Okinawa, they weren't actually operating a cat cafe. They were just a local NGO that was working to get cats out of the wild.
Mm.
So I think they were just working within their community to find suitable homes for these cats without having that cafe uh, front. Yeah,
Yeah. I will say, because it might be helpful for like some listeners to know like the experiences that you can get with, because I wouldn't go to a wild animal cafe because that is something that I make sure to research anyway. But I definitely have fallen into the trap of the cat cafe. So there's one even where I live in Durham, which is this really
yeah,
small little town in the northeast of England. You'd never think that there'd be sort of unethical cat cafe in this region. Like you'd think it would be rehoming. So there's a cat cafe. My husband and I walk past it every other day, and we were kind of like, we should go in and support them, thinking it was like a shelter
yeah,
environment again. We go in, and it's purebred cats. I have to say, I do really love cats, but I'm not like one of those cat people that can identify breeds or anything.
yeah.
Because they were like the little smush face cats, the ones
Oh
that have
yeah,
the teeny noses.
yeah,
It was all those kind of cats, which I was initially like, oh, that's a bit strange. Doesn't kind of seem like a rescue environment. The cats were wearing clothes, which is again like I'm not massive fans of
yeah.
animals behaving outside
Yeah,
of
especially
the.
especially because cats like they have to clean themselves and they lick themselves in order to do that. So yeah,
Yeah, so that seemed a bit off. And then it's like you said, they were kind of like we limit interaction, we only let certain people in, like the cats have their own space, they have places to retreat to, though obviously we couldn't see those places. They're fed
yeah,
independently. So you're getting all these like sounds like a green flag kind of signs. But then, we left the cafe and we were kind of thinking, well, why were they all the same breed? And like, why were they wearing clothes? And why
yeah,
why aren't they being rehomed? Because I asked them, are you going to be rehoming any cats? And they said, no, not these ones. These belong to the owner. We might, like in future, have a rehoming program, but we don't right now. And these things start to add up. And it's like you said,
yeah.
asking those questions is really important.
Yeah, and I mean, there are, I think, people that have a lot of cats, and I interestingly read some Reddit threads about cat cafes in the UK, and it does seem that there's a lot of people that own cats that will then open a cafe, and they kind of let their cats like interact with people. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that model necessarily. I didn't really thought about it all that much because I mean maybe this person knows their cats and what they're like around people, but it's an interesting business model, and maybe not everyone who owns cats should open a business with cats. I don't know, right? Like I still think
Mm.
there's being a cat owner myself. I wouldn't call myself like a cat behaviorist in any way, So
Yeah,
yeah,
and
it's
I
an
think
interesting model to think about.
it is. And when you have dogs and cats yourself, they are very much individuals with their own personality. I would
Yeah,
find it difficult to use them as a commodity to make me
yeah,
money.
yeah.
But that's just me.
Yeah, for this conversation, there's a couple of cat cafes here in Vancouver, and I was looking at them, and I was like, do I want to kind of maybe go check one out and just see what they're like here? Um, yeah, I'm still kind of undecided, and I think it's because I'm like an obsessive rabbit hole kind of researcher person, and I send myself into this like spiral of I don't know, and like there's a part of me that's like maybe it's good to go check it out. There's a part of me that's like maybe I don't know if I'm getting like a weird feeling from these reviews, probably not. So it's difficult even for people like us to know fully, and we'll never fully know like what happens behind doors. And I mean I struggle even with knowing what is good and what's so it's tough. Yeah,
Yeah, which sort of brings us really neatly to the next question, which we were kind of saying before we even got into this podcast, that RSPCA and organizations like PETA have taken the stance that animal cafes, particularly cat cafes, are going to use quotation marks for this, but never ethical in any circumstances, and that there should be kind of like a full ban. They said it was some kind of licensing issue. There's all sorts of things going on. We did talk about this a little bit before we came on, but I guess what are your thoughts on this particular stance? Is that correct in your opinion? Or yeah.
Yeah. I'll start by saying if you couldn't tell from my accent, I am not from the UK. But and I actually did look if the British Columbia SPCA had something similar of a statement calling for an outright ban. I could not find one.
Yeah.
But I went through and I read the RSPCA. I don't know if it was like a press release kind of on their website where they were calling for this total ban. I think they had a few valid points, and then I disagreed, I think, with some of them in some capacity. One of the things they highlighted was that there was like a 44% increase in the number of animal cafes across the UK in 1 year alone. And that does indicate there is somewhat of like a trend shifting more from this like smaller kind of maybe community based model to something that's more of like capitalizing on a popular business opportunity that's growing that kind of indicates more of the shift to like a profit driven commercialized maybe model. That's all hearsay, but I could see that if there's a huge increase in 1 year, it's kind of maybe like starting to trend or be trendy to open a cat cafe. um, and then they talked a lot about the licensing. Like there is an issue with licensing. I don't think the UK had like a specific license for this, and some were operating without licenses. So that's, I think, a big problem as well. I think I diverged slightly from maybe like a total all-out ban, um, for like a few reasons. I think some of their statements kind of lacked like general evidence-based information. So they were saying like it was almost like all cats and all cat cafes are stressed. For me, I want to see that in like a data. Like, are cats more stressed in a shelter? Are they more stressed in a cafe? Is there a type of cafe that's run where they're the least stressed? And can we use that to build like a framework or like an appropriate business model for like of regulations of how these cafes should be operating? Maybe there needs to be a license developed for these cafes that follow like very rigorous standards with like welfare checks that are coming through, um, that sort of thing. So maybe they need to be more seriously regulated, better checks and balances for just like who can open them. But I do think sometimes these organizations take like, if the majority bad, it's all bad. If the majority good, it's okay. And I do think that they're looking at this like the majority of the cat cafes that they're seeing are concerning and problematic. Therefore, there's just like no room for improvement. And so I think they're kind of looking at this in like a binary argument rather than maybe working on like reform, regulation, licensing. But I do kind of agree that I think the really good ones are few and far between. So if you can't maybe bring things up to standards, maybe they do need to be phased out, and there needs to be better models for like working with shelters to provide adoption through like different means that doesn't involve this like transactional experience. So I'm kind of in this, I can see both sides of their argument.
Yeah. For me, it's like they're being very absolutist in the way that they're
Yeah,
thinking. And I understand this because I feel that what they're saying is cats, dogs, domesticated animals, etc., shouldn't be in a cafe for eternity. And I think
yeah,
yes, we all think that. Like
yeah,
anybody who's looked into this properly agrees that like
yeah,
a cafe, just like a shelter, is not the end goal for a cat or a
yeah.
dog or anything else that's going to be adopted. That said, stress is not trauma. And if you need to get a cat or a dog out of a shelter environment where they are getting very stressed and it could potentially lead to trauma, and you can put them in an environment where they may be slightly less stressed, like a cafe,
Mhm.
and it's for
And
the
that's what I was
own.
saying. I feel like they didn't actually provide data on how stressed these cats are and what are the long-term impacts of that. It was just like, we think most cats are stressed in this situation.
Yeah.
Are you like, how do you prove that? And I mean, there is a very valid argument that these places are better environments than a shelter to put cats, like out in visibility for adoption. So yeah, like looking at kind of what model of a cafe is best and like building some regulation around that and building some guidelines. Because it sounds like the UK definitely needs a kind of better licensing and better regulation around this. And I think that is a viable path forward rather than just kind of this like absolutist none of these are good. So I'm
Mm.
always a advocate for like reforming things and making them better and like work making them better for the animals and better for people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm surprised that I diverge from what the RSPCA is saying more than anything because I do usually agree that if there's like a hint of it being bad for the animal, then absolutely not. But as someone who has started volunteering in rescue, has been interested in rescue for like a lot of my
yeah,
life and has rescued dogs, like I do think that there needs to be some kind of better solution and this could be worked in. Like I also want to be clear as well that when we're talking about better licensing, this also needs to include really stringent regulation for making sure that the cats and dogs and other animals have like access to spaces that are just theirs, can express their natural behaviors and instincts and not like placed in clothes and that kind of thing, and can limit
yeah.
interactions.
And I mean, to be honest, like I don't think any cat is expressing its natural behavior in a shelter in some capacity, right? Like, I mean, I know a lot of people that have gone in to adopt a cat, and the shelter says like this cat is really it's mean, it's scared, it's angry, it's not going to warm up to you. And as soon as they take it home, it is the most like loving, relaxed cat. So like these shelters are like highly stressful situations for these animals, and they're not expressing their natural behaviors oftentimes, right? So like cafes can kind of provide this space where they're a little bit more able to express that. And I do think their chances of adoption are possibly higher if you can see that in a cat. I know one of the cafes here in Vancouver, they were so successful with their adoption rate out that they temporarily close occasionally because they're able to completely adopt all their cats out.
Wow.
They'll close their business operations temporarily until they work with the BCSPCA to, they basically will like work with them to get the right cats in this environment. So the BCSPCA is like, we have these 10 cats, they all get along, they can be in this cafe setting. So I was impressed by that model
Really
that they were
cool.
even able to like shut down operations and be willing to do that and forego money rather than just like desperately, oh, we have to like get more cats because we adopted them all out. They were like, okay, we want to like make sure we get another group of cats in, they're the right group of cats. And they've had quite a successful model of adopting cats. And so I think if I do visit one, I would probably visit that one maybe and check it out.
That's incredible. I mean, I can
Yeah.
also say, like, as you know, you guys have seen the dog that was here. She's my foster dog, and when she came to us, she was quite traumatized, from various things that happened to her, and she was very stressed as well. She was very like not doing well in the shelter environment. She came to us as a foster, and she's been doing great. One of the first things we did with her was take her to a cafe just by chance on like the fifth day we had her or something because we were all going on an outing. She loved it. She actually got adopted there. Like she's going to her
Oh,
new home because she was so like excited and not stressed to be in the cafe
yeah.
environment. So yeah, it's not all cats and dogs.
Yeah. So yeah, I find, right, and that's kind of what I was hinting at. Sometimes these big organizations just work in binary
Yeah.
silos, like good, bad, total ban, no regulation. And I'm like, there is these animal cafes exist on a huge spectrum. And I think you need to kind of like uplift and support the ones that are doing good, and the ones that are problematic, like provide reform for them and working guidelines. And yeah, I ended up on this Reddit thread and people were discussing this RSPCA thing on Reddit. And I assume it was a bunch of people from the UK having this conversation. And I mean, there were a couple people on there that were like, I love cats. I own cats. I want to like, I looked into opening a cafe. It was fairly easy. It shouldn't necessarily just be like, I have cats. I want to open a cat cafe. Right. It like, and I think, going back to, my ideal model of one is there community organizations that are really working within their community to provide a valuable service, to provide vetted adoptions and get animals out of shelters and get them into homes. And so I think that right that flow and working model is really great, and kind of finding ways to like incentivize, regulate, provide better, a specific licensing for an animal cafe is probably the way
Yeah.
to go.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm quite surprised to see it from the RSPCA anyway, because they're not normally so absolute. It's like PETA, I would expect it from them.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think even I was looked at I say PETA, but I looked at the PETA website, and even their statement was it was more like the one I came across was more of an educational tool. And there was a paragraph on there saying that there are ethical cat cafes. And I was actually
Oh,
shocked to read that from, I was like, I don't think they ever think anything is ethical. But it was just, like a small little thing that there are, like what is an ethical cat cafe? And it was kind of a more educational thing. So yeah, I do think the RSPCA is a bit of a hard lined take that I don't really think benefits anybody. Like it maybe shuts down the ones that are problematic, but right, like I'm all for reform of problematic things. I take that stance with a lot of things that I think are deeply problematic, that reform sometimes is better than just banning.
yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds like the RSPCA have potentially seen a lot of issues with the other side of it and like the breeding.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, but I want to see that information maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of vague statements of from them. So I feel like maybe I just didn't see it, but I would like to see, like yeah, like how stressed are these cats? Like,
A
what is the
study.
licensing issue? Like, go out and see how many are unlicensed and how they're operating, and maybe like do a big report on that. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, it's time I think to trust the public with this kind of information because ultimately a lot of people do things without knowing why. And then if you
Yeah,
tell them why they can't, like they're going to continue. But
yeah.
anyway, I guess from my side, that is all my questions. Did you have anything else you want to add? I know you do research your topics very thoroughly, so if there's anything I've missed, please feel free to let us know.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I'm trying to think of anything. Yeah, I mean, I guess anywhere where like different countries, right, have different kind of welfare expectations
Yeah.
or awareness regulation. I would say like the majority of I don't want to say the majority because there's certain states. Yeah, so there are certain countries that I think do really good with in terms of like welfare regulation, and some countries have different standards of welfare. So, possibly doing a little bit of research before you visit a country as to what their kind of like general understanding of animal welfare is, or their general approach to captive animal experiences can kind of give you some social context or like site specific context into the type of cafe. Because like in general, cafes are going to be a little bit better in places that have very strict welfare laws and guidelines. And so just kind of doing some general is, X country, how are they with like animal welfare and captive animal experiences, and kind of give yourself that knowledge, and it will help you do a little bit more research or kind of give you a good foundation. Like I want to be extra careful in this country if I'm traveling through here. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's cultural element, right? Because obviously in Japan, these cafes are really huge, and that's like kawaii culture and like
Yeah.
wanting to be around things that are cute. And that is not something that I think you or I are here to pass judgment on. It is a completely like different approach, attitude from maybe the countries that we live in, that we grew up in. And
Yeah.
not for the sake of judging that, but I think when it comes to like welfare and ethics and animal rights, there kind of has to be a sort of global standard. And if it's not already in place within the country, then
Yeah.
unfortunately it does fall on the travelers to research it.
Yeah. A lot of the research that I found that was rather critical of these cafes actually was coming from like Japanese universities,
Yeah.
WWF, like Japan. So I do think that there is kind of this like growing body of research and awareness as well, at least from kind of the more like academic side. And hopefully that kind of has like a shift overall. But yeah, I think in general, you can kind of be like, okay, I need to be a little bit more careful in this country when it comes to like captive animal experiences. You should always be careful, but I
Mm.
think kind of knowing where a country stands in terms of their like overarching laws when it comes to animal welfare can be a little helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And it is individual research because I wouldn't even know which countries to tell you guys. Like this one doesn't.
Yeah, it like yeah, I wouldn't either. So just like a search of like I'm traveling here, what is their relationship with, captive animals and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Well, do you have any projects that you're working on at the moment? And can you let us know where people can find you?
Yeah, I just launched my YouTube, which is exciting. So yeah, I have a couple of new YouTube videos out. So yeah, you can find me on YouTube now. Very exciting. And in general, yeah, I'm at curiositysavstravel.com or curiositysaves.travel for Instagram and social media.
Perfect. Amazing. Well, this has been the Sustainable Travel Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at the Sustainable Travel Podcast or on my website, which is thattravel.co.uk. Or you can find us on YouTube at that_travel. Thank you so much.